Well, you've asked for it, and now you're going to get it. This is course SC-900, the full authorized Microsoft course on security, identity, and compliance fundamentals. Are you ready to learn? Greetings, fellow YouTubers. First of all, a very happy new year. Thanks so much for coming to the channel. I really appreciate you taking the time. This time, I'm going to kick off with something new and exciting. This is going to be course SC-900, and this is the Security, Compliance, and Fundamentals of Identity course. And this is the full authorized course that you're going to get to see free of charge, and more importantly, we're going to break it down into 4 parts. So this first module, we're going to take a look at the very fundamentals of security, compliance, and identity, and just talk a little bit about exactly what it is and how it works. Please note that this course was recorded just a couple of weeks ago. I was delivering it online to a customer, and I thought, hey, you know, this is going to be great for you guys. So I think without any more jibber jabber, I think it's time to get going with module 1. Are you ready? So essentially this course consists of 4 areas. So the first one is describing the concepts of identity, security, and compliance. Then describing the capabilities of the Microsoft Identity and Access Management solutions. We're going to talk about the capabilities of Microsoft security solutions, and we're also going to talk about compliance solutions as well. Now, in terms of the certification itself, this is the SC-900. It comprises of 4 sections, which, as I said, pretty much match the courseware that we have for you. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, a very good morning. We're going to kick off now with module 1. This is describing the concepts of security, compliance, and identity. Now, in this section, we're going to talk about the security and compliance concepts. We'll talk about the methodologies, and we're also going to describe the identity concepts as well. So identity is such an important area, certainly for security, because if you think about it, it's the first door, it's the doorway into your organization. So how we identify ourselves and then how we authenticate ourselves, i.e. prove who we are, is really important. All right, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So lesson number 1 is describing the security and compliance concepts and methodologies. So in this session, we're going to talk about describing Microsoft's zero trust and shared responsibility models. We'll talk about describing common security threats. So what are the current threats that we have in 2021? Well, I tell you, whoever thought that COVID would have done the rounds, eh? Nobody's seen that coming. Excuse me. We'll also talk about describing the concepts of encryption and hashing, and we'll talk about describing the cloud adoption framework. Please note what it's saying. You'll be able to describe. You'll be able to, the word describe. That's partly what this exam is about, folks. It's about just, you don't need to be an expert. Just describe the basics, okay? That's what we're really looking for here. So Microsoft, first of all, the thing that you need to understand is that the cloud is a, obviously, it's a service. So whether you are having an infrastructure as a service, whether you're hosting your own systems in the cloud, or whether you're using a software as a service. So for example, Microsoft 365 is software as a service. Obviously, there's a lot of trust that we place in with Microsoft. So companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they have a lot of power because they have our data stored. Now, Microsoft have a number of guidelines, and one of those guidelines is called the Zero Trust methodology. So the idea here is that you verify explicitly. So you trust no one, but you verify everyone. All right, that's the key thing here. We have this concept of least privilege. And what that means is, well, in the cloud, there is a user account and then there is an administrator account. So an administrator account is God, potentially. So this is the global admin role. Now, what Microsoft have done is we now have something called RBAC, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on. And RBAC really refers to different levels of administrator access. So, for example, you might be a SharePoint administrator. You might be a Teams administrator. You get the idea? So you don't necessarily need to have that global admin. You don't need to be able to see everything to perform your job. So just what you need. We call it GIA, just enough administration. All right. So the trust guiding principles: trust no one and verify everything. So when that person logs in, we need to prove who they are. The least privileged access. So if they are going to get privileges, only give them what they need, not necessarily what they want. Also, we have this concept of assumed breach. And what does that mean? Well, back in the 1990s, of course, we had the idea of the client server environment. And the client server environment was essentially, it was a bit like the old days of the Industrial Revolution. You would go through the factory gates in the morning, you would go and do your job, and at the end of the day, you would walk out those gates and that would be it. Today, we don't do that. We're 24/7, baby. We're online all the time. All right. So how did we protect ourselves back in the 90s? We had firewalls, we have antivirus, we have all of those things to essentially prevent the bad guy from coming in. And what Microsoft have discovered, or what Microsoft suggests now, is that look, guys, the chances are the bad guys are probably already on your network. Now, when somebody says assumed breach, you suddenly start to look at security in a very different way. All right. So security typically here has 6 foundational pillars. Identity. So this can be a user, it can be a service, and it can also be a device. So I've got my phone connected to Microsoft 365, for example. So I can manage not just users, but I can also manage devices as well, which is very cool. Applications. So again, I can manage the applications on these devices. Yes. So I can select, what is a trusted application, what is not a trusted application. And most importantly, of course, you have to be able to protect the data on those devices as well. Now, I mentioned infrastructure. So infrastructure, of course, can either be on premises, i.e. where you work, or it can be cloud-based, all right? And the concept of networks. So a network, of course, networks are great because we can connect together, we can work together, but what Microsoft suggests is networks should be divided. So segment your networks. Don't have one large network, have a number of different network segments. So the idea is if a bad guy got onto your network, he's not onto your entire network. You understand? Okay. What else have we got? Now, that very much leads into this model. This is called the defense in depth model. I like to call it the Game of Thrones model, okay? And if you're in Ireland, you'll know about Game of Thrones, of course. So imagine that data is the very heart of everything. So our data needs to be the most secure, and this represents the king, of course. So We protect the king, we protect the data. How do we protect the king? We build walls around him. It might be applications in this case. So how are who's got access to those applications? The compute layer. So in the data center, the compute layer typically is software as a service. For example, Microsoft 365, Microsoft Dynamics. Then you've got the network. You've got the perimeter layer. So the perimeter protects us against things like distributed denial of service attacks. And then, of course, on the outer layers, we've got our identity and access layer. So imagine if you're going into an airport. So if you're going into an airport, it's going to have public areas and it's going to have private areas. And to get through those private areas, you're going to need to have some form of ID, whether it's your passport. So your passport is your authentication. It's proving who you are. Whereas your ticket, your airline ticket, is your authorization to be in those areas. Okay, so often identity, access, identification, and authentication often go together. The very far layer, the very open layer, is the physical security. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever had a chance to visit a data center. It's a fascinating place to go and see. So obviously we've got fences, you've got guards, you're going to have different layers of security, all designed to protect that important data at the very center. Now, I teach security, and if you pick up any security book, you're going to learn about the CIA, and this is not the Central Intelligence Agency, no. As an IT guy, as a security guy, these are the fundamental things that we need to protect. We need to protect confidentiality. How do we do that? Keep secrets, keep passwords secure, encrypt data, so make it unreadable by an adversary, for example. Integrity. So integrity refers to keeping the data and messages correct. So if I download an application, often a vendor will sign the application with a hashing, a hash key, and I'll talk about that in a second. And this guarantees that the data hasn't been compromised. Likewise, if I send an email from my bank account, you can use encryption and digital signatures. Again, it guarantees that, hey, it's authentic, it's actually coming from the bank, but also it's not been interfered with. Availability, of course, every good IT guy knows that doing backups, making sure that systems are available, network clustering, and so on, high availability is really important. So if something fails, you have some kind of failover mechanism, okay? So everybody knows that we should have a backup of our data. Now, in the Microsoft Cloud, there are at least, let's say OneDrive, for example, there are at least 10 copies of your data in the Microsoft Cloud. Oops, sorry, wrong way. Okay. Now, I did mention that the cloud is a shared responsibility model, and typically we have a number of different service offerings that providers will provide. So I'll start at the very bottom here, an on-premises. So where the customer is completely on premises, they can have everything themselves. There is nothing in the cloud, and they are completely responsible for their own environment. All right. The next level up might be, let's say, infrastructure as a service. So infrastructure as a service is where the company may provide virtual machines, a virtual environment, and it might maintain hardware, operating systems. Okay. So there's a little bit of kind of shared responsibility there. Platform as a service, things like Microsoft Azure is a platform as a service. In fact, Microsoft Azure has grown. It's got hundreds and thousands of different services in it now. It's not just a single service. I remember when Azure started and it was just 3 services. It's come a long way, actually. And then, as I mentioned, software as a service. So software as a service is where everything is managed and maintained by the cloud service provider. So there is nothing on premises whatsoever. There's no infrastructure from your part, no servers, nothing. Okay, and this is called software as a service. Now, Microsoft have this thing called shared responsibility model, and if I just flip over here, I'm going to flip over here to, let's say, this is Microsoft 365 here. As you can see, if I go into, for example, the admin center in Microsoft 365, you can see that we can manage and maintain all our user accounts in here. So I can create my users, I can manage my users in here, I can manage my administrators, and I can also manage the different aspects of Microsoft 365 as well. So things like security and compliance and endpoint and Azure Active Directory, all of which I'm going to explain today for you. And then you've got the different applications, and this is the admin centers for things like Exchange and SharePoint and so on. Now, hang on a minute, Andy, you just said that in the cloud, Microsoft take care of everything for us. That's true, I did. However, I also mentioned that Microsoft 365 is a shared responsibility model. And what that means is Microsoft provides you with the infrastructure. They provide you with the tools, but you have to configure the tools. All right. So you have to go in and set the permissions, create the users, manage the security, configure the compliance settings. You are responsible for that. You understand? Okay. And that's what we mean by this concept of a shared responsibility model. All right. Okay. Now, Microsoft's cloud adoption framework essentially consists of a number of elements. So basically, the concept here is everything has a life cycle. Okay. So now, companies who are saying, hey, we're thinking about moving to the cloud. Dude, the cloud is 10 years old. It's been around for 10 years. We're all in the cloud at the moment. It's just how you're going to manage it. So like any kind of adoption process, especially in terms of security, we need some kind of life cycle. And this is what we call the cloud adoption framework. So obviously define your strategy, plan it out, prepare for getting into the cloud. This might include, for example, opening up some test accounts or something like that. And then you might need to migrate. So migrate your data across. You can, for example, if you're migrating your email to Exchange Online, or if you're migrating your data into SharePoint or Teams and so on. And then ultimately, we need to think about how you're going to not control access to the data, but govern access to the data in a responsible way. All right, governing and managing are really important. Okay. Now, 2020 and 2021 has, we've seen an awful lot of different types of attacks. All right. And you can see that here, this is some common types of threats. So we have a data breach. We have a dictionary attack and ransomware, and also a disruptive type attack as well. Sorry, somebody's just trying to call me on my phone. So a data breach, for example, phishing. I mean, we have all experienced phishing attacks. So a phishing attack is where hackers, criminals will essentially try and lure you in to give away your either your identity information, your username, your password, or what they might try and do is just get you to log into a fake website in order to steal your financial information, credit cards and things like that. So phishing and spear phishing, very similar. Spear phishing is where you're looking for a particular person within a company. For example, a CEO, an accounts department, somebody like that. And I'm sure we've all seen those types of emails. There's also those famous tech support scams. They're great, and they're still doing the rounds. You know, my name's Bob. I'm calling you from Microsoft. You know, I believe you're having a problem with your machine. Let me help you. I'm sure he will help you. Things like malware as well. So ransomware is particularly nasty at the moment. Dictionary attacks. So when we talk about passwords, typically use anything up to 12 characters. Now, to be honest, there are tools out there, Cain and Abel, Loofcrack, what else? John the Ripper. All of these tools are like 20 plus years old, but they still work beautifully. All right. And the reason is because they look for simple passwords. And I know what you think. You're probably saying to me, oh, Andy, we're clever with our passwords. We use funny characters. What you mean, like the @ symbol for an A and the $ symbol for an S? Come on, they know that. It doesn't matter. If you really must use passwords, use passphrases instead. So a passphrase is essentially a virtual password. So I love Star Trek TNG, right? So most password cracking tools look for passwords less than 12 characters. But if you've got a long password, that would give you a little bit of protection, all right? Ransomware is a whole new layer of problems, okay? So ransomware is malware, of course, that encrypts files and folders. And the latest generation of ransomware, by the way, is not just attacking infrastructure, so on-premises infrastructure, it's actually targeting backups at the moment. So it's particularly cruel. Okay. And then you're going to have some kind of disruptive attack. So denial of service attacks. What this type of attack does, it attempts to send so much data down the wire that your network connection or your server can't handle it, and it basically takes a wobbler, it falls over, and basically it denies you from service. It means that you can't get a connection. Okay. How can I protect the data? Okay, encryption is a fantastic tool in order to protect data. So there are two types, well actually there are three types of encryption. You can use either symmetric encryption or you can use asymmetric encryption. So for example, if you've got a Windows 10 or Windows 11 machine, then we have an encryption algorithm called BitLocker. And BitLocker is a data at rest solution. And it uses a single shared key, okay, to encrypt your data and then unencrypt your data. Particularly useful for very large volumes of data. Whereas asymmetric encryption typically uses public-private key cryptography. In other words, uses a public key and a private key pair. What do I mean? Well, let's say you're Bob, okay? I'm going to send you an email, right? I write an email and I encrypt that email with my private key. I then send it to your email address, which is your public key. You receive the email and you can see that it's coming from my private key. Sorry, my public key. And you can encrypt it or decrypt it rather with your private key. Yes, so a public private key pair. You understand? Okay, so this is particularly useful for data in transit. So HTTPS, for example. And of course, we can see this every day by the little padlock that's on our web browsers here. And you can see, I can see that the connection is secure. You can have a look at the certificate if you want to. All right. Okay, hashing is the third type of encryption, and hashing is a one-way process. It's a one-way hashing process. And typically what it does is it has a fixed field. So for example, if I just pop into, let's say Microsoft Edge here, and I'll just say, let's say crypto hash value. Okay, let's have a look. You see, so basically what it does here is, let me just zoom in here. Yes, so you can see here that we have the word fox, and you run the word fox through a cryptographic function, and the output is always the same. You see, it's the same fixed length. And the idea is that even if you change one word, the value will change. Okay, so you can see this particular cryptographic algorithm here, this hash value, we've just changed one letter. Do you see that? One letter has changed and the crypto hash has completely changed. So if I was sending you an email, you could see the hash value that I'd used and the hash value that it arrived with. If that hash value was different, you know that it's been changed. You know that it's been manipulated and it's not genuine. That's the idea behind the hashing algorithms. All right. Okay, so identity. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a sip of a drink. So let's talk about identity. Identity is really important because it's the front door into your organization. All right. So you need to know, obviously, you know, if I imagine a reception desk. So when I walk into your building, how do I identify myself? I might show you some form of ID, a passport, a letter of authorization or something like that. So identity is so important. All right. So in this session, we're going to talk about using the concept of identity as a security perimeter. Identity is the first and last security perimeter. It's so important. Understand the difference between authentication and authorization, and also describe the identity related services that Microsoft 365 provides. Okay, so in this section then, let's talk about the identity concepts. So using the concept of identity as that all-important security perimeter. We'll talk about understanding the difference between authentication and authorization. And as I said, I'm going to mention those identity related services. Now, the reason why identity is so important and the reason why bad guys are desperate to steal your identity is because typically if you've got simple passwords on stuff, the number of passwords obviously that are out there, it's so important. If I can find out your username and your password, I could basically, what could I do? I could get into a bank account. I could steal your identity. And with your identity, I could make purchases in your name. I could commit fraud. So obviously, there's a lot of dangerous things that you could do out there. Now, when we talked about identity attacks, the most common attacks, as you can see here, are password-based attacks. All right. And it's crazy, some of the passwords that people use. All right. Password one. And you might think, okay, well, I'm going to go through the cast of Star Trek The Next Generation, Jean-Luc Picard 1, and then people start putting numbers on things, Jean-Luc Picard 2, and your date of birth, your wife's date of birth. Another concept is we have something that's not on here. It's called password spray. And I think so many people are guilty of this. Password spray is where, let's say, you use your same password for a number of different websites, or the same PIN number for a number of different credit cards. Okay. And before you know it, you've not just lost information from one of your bank accounts, but all of your bank accounts because of bad practice. All right. Now, phishing attacks, you can see here an attacker will typically target a particular user. And a phishing attack, I'll try and send you a malicious email, and hopefully you'll go ahead and click on that malicious link. All right, which is obviously really dangerous. And then, of course, once the hacker has access to your account, he can then be authenticated. Okay. So identity is the first and primary security perimeter. All right. So everything has an identity, by the way. So a user has an identity, an application has an identity, a device. Andy, what do you mean when you say a user and an application have got an identity? Okay. Now, if you can imagine, I'm just going to flip over here into Microsoft 365. So in Microsoft 365 here, what we have is we have, this is the administration center in Microsoft 365. And in here, I'm going to go into my users and groups. Okay, so here is a complete list of all my users and groups. Now, obviously, we need some kind of, identity service. And in Microsoft Azure and Microsoft 365, Azure Active Directory is a complete database of users, groups, and devices. Okay. It has a couple of different interfaces. So whether I create a user here or whether I create a user in Azure Active Directory, Andy, what do you mean? You just said that they were the same thing. Well, there is actually a separate tool here for Azure Active Directory. And if I click into here, you will see here is Azure Active Directory. And if I click into Azure AD, look at this, I've got the same users and groups as before. Okay. Now, with Microsoft 365 and Azure, there is no one portal to rule them all, to coin a phrase from Lord of the Rings. Okay, so some of the features that you want to do are only available in maybe one portal or another portal, but you just get that with experience, by the way. All right. So what I'm going to do here is I'll just create a quick user. So I'm going to add a user here, and we'll call this user, what should we call him? We'll call him Jean-Luc. We'll call him Jean-Luc Picard. I'm a Trekkie, what can I say? And I'm going to give him a username of Picard J. And you can see I'm automatically generating a password for this user. I'll click next. And the next thing is obviously select a location. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is really important because it determines where the user's data will be stored. Okay, so if you're in Ireland, it would go into the Dublin data center. If you're in Norway, it would go into the Norwegian data center. I'm in the UK, it would go into the UK data center. So you can do that. The next thing is, okay, do I want to assign a license for a user? Okay, so yeah, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to assign an E3 license for this user, as well as an enterprise license for Windows here. Okay, I'm going to say, yeah, okay, cool. I'll click next. And it says here, roles, user, no admin access. So do you want to grant this user administrator access for anything? So remember what I said earlier, RBAC, role-based admin. Now, the global admin is God. He can basically do everything. The second most powerful role is the user administrator role. And beyond that, we also have a number of other roles as well. Now, just to flip over into Azure Active Directory, in Azure AD, again, you've got roles and administrators, but here it looks like there are hundreds of roles, and there are quite a few different roles because some roles have sub roles within them. So for example, let me get down to Teams. So here, just as an example, the Teams administrator can do everything, but then you've got some sub groups here. So for example, a device administrator. So this might be a junior person within your company that's managing just Teams devices, setting them up, for example. Communications specialist. Okay, so somebody who's specializing in the networking side of Teams. The support engineer, somebody who's setting the Teams displays up and things like that. You get the idea? Again, so when you first look at this, it looks a little bit overwhelming, but actually when you stop and just look at it, take a moment to look at it, it's actually not too bad. All right. Okay, so for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to make this guy a Teams and a SharePoint admin. Okay, can I just mention, by the way, that if you had pure administrator accounts, you don't need a license. So you don't need a Microsoft 365 or an Azure license to be an administrator. Okay. All right, so I'm going to click next and I get a nice review. Finally, it says, yep, finish adding. Finally, it will say, hey, do you want to save this as a template so that you could use this type of account again? Hey, that sounds like a great idea. So I could call this my Dublin staff. Okay. And oops, sorry, just fix that. And I could then go ahead and say, yeah, let's save this as a template and then close. Okay. So now if I wanted to create a user who's based in Dublin, who has those same licenses, check it out. Look, I can now use the Dublin staff template here. Okay. And look, I can go into Azure Active Directory. So just go back in to Azure AD, back into users. And if I scroll down, just load a few more here. Yes, look, there is my friend, Jean-Luc Picard. And you can see assigned roles. So this will come in. Yeah, there you go. He's a SharePoint and Teams, just exactly the same. You see what I mean? So again, so do you administer him in the 365 portal or do you administer him in the Azure portal? It's up to yourself, whatever you think. So pillars of identity, administration, obviously, authentication. So obviously, how do I prove who I am? Well, would you use a password? Probably not. You can use, if you've got a Windows machine, you can use Windows Hello. Yes, so biometric authentication, your fingerprint, your handprint, your face, and so on. Once you've been authenticated, so once you've proven who you are, you're then authorized to gain access to a resource. And then finally, everything is audited. So there is an audit log, okay, that says this is what you did, okay? Modern authentication and the role of the identity provider. So whenever you see IDP, that means identity provider. So an identity provider offers authentication, authorization, and auditing services. It's a fundamental capability to authenticate your users and a requirement for something called single sign-on. Single sign-on is basically great. It's a mechanism for once a user signs in, you don't need to then every time you go to a let's say Microsoft 365, you know, if I sign in with my corporate ID and then I go to Microsoft 365, it just passes that request straight through. I don't need to then re-authenticate, okay? Because that would be a pain, wouldn't it? Now, there's a protocol that helps with modern authentication. So what we mean by modern authentication, all right, let me show you. So modern authentication that's just a basic username and password. So I just set up a username and password for John Luke. But what you can do is you can also configure something called multi-factor authentication. And multi-factor authentication is an absolute must, okay? So, and the reason is that a password is just something that you know. It doesn't prove who you are, it just proves that you know the username and password. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to, let's find John Luke's account, okay? Jean Luc. Yep. So here's Jean-Luc Picard. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable multi-factor authentication. All right. So I'm going to enable that. So now the next time that Jean-Luc logs in, it's going to say, hey, your account has been marked for multi-factor authentication. Do you want to use some other means of authentication? So I'm sure. Let me just bring this up to show you. Let me just bring this up. Yes. So this is the multi-factor. I'm sure we've all seen this, yeah? I'm just using my face. There we go. This is the multi-factor authenticator app, okay? And in here, it will then say, hey, you know, you can use this app. So use the app, use your beautiful face, and then authorize that access. Okay. Now, and this is so important, okay, because of course, what's this? This is just an email address. And an email address, guys, come on, you're halfway there to hacking somebody's account. So there are tons of automated tools constantly trying to hack into these email addresses. All right. And if all you're protecting it with is a password, eventually it would get in, right? But if you're using multi-factor authentication, this is not just something that you know, but this is something that you have. So I have my device and it's something that I am. You understand? So it's my face, it's multi-factor authentication, okay? And I got to tell you, this will decrease hacking attacks by 99%. Seriously, okay? Really good. So traditional, so concept of federation is fantastic, okay? So basically federated access basically means the users of one system can access a second system without having to re-authenticate because the two parties have an agreement. That's what it essentially means. All right, so here is a door, okay? And I need to identify myself before I get into the building. How do we do that? We go to the reception desk. We identify ourselves either to a receptionist or we go through one of these barriers like at Microsoft in Dublin, yes? Once you're authenticated, of course, you may not be authorized to gain access to everywhere in the building. So for example, in an airport, so just because you get through the door, there are parts of the airport that you're not authorized to go for safety reasons, of course. Active Directory is Microsoft's directory database. It came out in 2000, and it replaced an old system called Windows NT. And Windows 2000 introduced something called Active Directory. There are two sides to Active Directory. On the left-hand side, it's nothing more than a physical database on a file server, on a server, okay? On the right-hand side, this is the logical structure of something. So think of it like File Explorer in Windows. You could have File Explorer in Windows, and you wouldn't just throw everything into the C drive, for example. You would create folders. And in this case, we call them organizational units, and to represent each department in your company or each location. But the fact is that this was a database. Okay. So this is Active Directory Domain Services. Now, the problem with this is obviously it's a single point of failure because it's on a single database. We organized our users by organizational units, and here we created our objects. So objects are in the database, users, computers, groups, and every user has attributes, a first name, last name, and an email address, and so on. All right. Now, of course, that's the logical side of Active Directory. The physical side of Active Directory is that, of course, it was a database. And this was the problem. So let's say, for example, here we've got Dublin, and here site B is London. So we had one domain controller, and this is what we called a server that had a copy of the Active Directory database on it. So for redundancy reasons, we would have a second server or even a third server, and this would have a multi-master replication model. So if anything changed, it would automatically trigger a replication, and we call this intra-site replication. And you could then configure an inter-site replication for redundancy, okay? So, and that's essentially how Active Directory worked. And it was a lot of work. You can imagine it was expensive. There was a lot of work here. And also, it didn't scale well. So here you could only have one copy of Active Directory. This was only one company in Active Directory. So instead of that, we have identity as a service. So Azure Active Directory is Microsoft's Azure version, or the next generation of Active Directory. And this is basically hosted on Azure. And in Azure, Azure is like the C drive of your computer. So whenever you sign up to a service in Azure, for example, Microsoft 365 or Dynamics, you have your tenant. You manage your tenant, your users, your computers, all within Azure Active Directory. You understand? So there's none of that infrastructure, none of that expense that you need to think about, because that's what you're paying Microsoft for, okay? And that's identity as a service, all right? Again, once a user's authenticated, they have access to the world. Again, attributes, just exactly the same as Active Directory. Okay, so there we go. We talked about the basics, concepts, zero trust. We talked about identity concepts there as well. So there you have it, Module 1 of SC-900. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, give me a big thumbs up, and I really do appreciate it. Questions, comments, anything at all, please get them down below. And if you're not a subscriber, go ahead, click on that subscribe button, ring the bell, and you won't miss out on the future modules. Okay, so in a few days, I'll be posting module number 2. And as I say, it's about a 6-hour course altogether. But again, it's very doable and it's a good exam and a great foundational skill to have. Hey, well, listen, thanks so much for dropping by, and you stay safe. And once again, a very happy new year to you, and I'll see you next time. You take care. See you soon. Hey, thanks so much for dropping by today. Here's a couple of videos that you may enjoy, and while you're here, go ahead, click on the subscribe button and you won't miss out.